1.
Hi, my name is Tate Pfefferkorn, and I am doing my informative speech on how to replace an alternator in any kind of commercial vehicle, personal vehicle, family or friends, and just help you get some kind of information on doing your own maintenance on your vehicles. That way you don't have to take it to a dealership and get charged extra. You can purchase the parts yourself and do them at home in your own garage with the supplied amount of tools that you have or that you already probably have. So I put together a slideshow of just kind of some of the certain things that you might need for doing this kind of specific job. With some of these tools as well, you could also do some other things such as doing like your own oil change. You could replace headlight bulbs, which you don't even need tools for that. But I would say if you want to do any of your own kind of maintenance, the internet is basically your best friend. You can get online, you could actually look up the exact car that you have and probably watch a video of replacing something that someone had already did, basically kind of what I'm doing now, but I'm not physically doing the repair. I mean, I'm explaining it to you in somewhat of a depth that you could probably perform it yourself. So in the picture here, it shows an alternator. I also have one here in front of us that I have for my own vehicle as a backup, just in case something went wrong and I got a good deal on it. So obviously I bought it. So an alternator is basically just, what it does is it charges your battery here with the pulley system. And the pulley system is routed on the front of the engine or motor, whatever you want to call it, however you want to phrase it. So it's wound up with a bunch of coils inside, and there's some brushes, and there's a couple bearings inside. And those bearings and brushes can go bad and wear over time. There's copper inside, such as the winding that I've already explained. And over time it'll go bad and it'll start whining and make weird random noises that you won't be able to understand. And another tell is that your car battery will be dead when you go out to start it one day, or you're driving and your car randomly shuts off and you lose all power and your steering wheel becomes tight and the radio shuts off, the dash goes off, your speedometer's not working anymore. That could be a tell sign of your alternator. And if you have a serpentine belt, which is what wraps around here on the pulley, and it snaps as you're going down the highway and you lose all functions of the vehicle, the alternator could also be a reason why that happened. Because if one of those bearings is going so fast and gets so hot, just because this is all copper here and it gets hot creating electricity to charge your battery, it can just friction weld itself and completely stop and snap your belt and cause all kinds of things to go wrong with this in order for you, or needing you to repair it. So for the first step of it, you're going to want to make sure you have the proper tooling. I've been in plenty of situations where I've had to work on something and I had to make do with what I had. I didn't have the proper tools. So the first thing that I would recommend having is a 3/8 ratchet, which I have here. Is just a simple ratchet. You can get it in any hardware store and almost anywhere. They're fairly cheap, and I mean, people say you pay for what you get, and I think just about any ratchet that you buy is just as good as any other. So unless you're doing it for a professional living and it's your career, then you might want to step up your game and buy something that is durable or has a warranty of such. But if you're just doing personal work at home, I think a standard 3/8 ratchet from your local hardware store or car auto parts store would be just fine. The next thing I would get would be a set of sockets, metric and standard. I only brought a metric set from work just because I think it would be overkill to bring two different sets. I brought a regular shallow, goes from 10 to 17 millimeter sockets. These are 12 point. It doesn't really matter if they're 12 point or 6 point as long as you have the right size socket for the right size bolt. These are metric 10 to 17 mil as well. They're deep well sockets. They're just a different type of socket that if the bolt's on a stud or something, such as like if this alternator was mounted and there was a bolt going through it here and it came out the top here and there was a stud that the nut threaded onto that bolt in the stud that goes into the block, you could just use this socket. It would slip right over the stud and go right onto the nut and you wouldn't have any trouble with it. Whereas if you use the regular shallow socket, you would not be able to do that. So it just kind of comes in handy if you buy both. Most of the time they come in a kit with shallow and regular size sockets as well. Second thing I would say that you would, or third thing I guess I would say you'd probably need would be just a regular screwdriver set. That's just, everybody probably has a regular screwdriver set at home. And then you might just want a couple extensions, just in case the bolts are a little out of reach and you need to put them on your ratchet and use them to get into a place that you can't. So lastly, I would say you just need a standard set of wrenches, metric and standard, doesn't matter whichever one. Most of them fit each other. So that basically divvies up what you might need to do the certain repairs. So as long as you have the proper tools, then you'll probably be just fine. And another thing you'd want to do is make sure the part number matches the current alternator that you have and the alternator that's in your vehicle. You'd hate to get in there and take everything apart and not have the proper part to put back into it, because then you'd be out your vehicle and would not have it. So for step 2, first thing you're going to want to do, I know it's kind of just a no-brainer for me anyways, and probably some other people out there in the class or out there in the world. You're going to want to try and find your hood latch, which is normally located on the driver's side of your car. It's got a little hood emblem for your hood, and they make it fairly obvious to find. It's just a little lever, you pull it and you'll hear a pop, and you'll go up to the front of your hood and there's a latch. Normally you reach your finger in there and pinch yourself and it pops up and your hood's open. You see everything on the inside. So this is basically the first step. I know I said proper tooling and everything is the first step. This here would be the first step that I would do for my precaution. I would take the battery terminals off, just because when you're dealing with the alternator, there's 12 volts of electricity going to the power side of the alternator, which would be going into this connector here. On older fashioned alternators, there are multiple studs such as this one here, that there's power going to it, and there's also a ground stud, which is what I just touched. But if in that case, when you're taking off that other wire and you don't unhook your battery in a situation like that, you could electrocute yourself. So it's pretty simple to remove the terminal. You only have to remove the positive terminal for the battery if you really wanted to get it done quickly, which normally it's just a regular standard bolt, and you just take a screwdriver and pop it up off of there. And that takes me to step 3. The next step for the replacement would be, you want to locate your belt tensioner, which would be to remove the belt off of the pulley system at the front of the engine, which that's a fairly simple yet lengthy task if you're by yourself. So you'd want to use a 1/2 inch ratchet for the most part. Most tensioners are a 1/2 inch ratchet input. It's just the square here on the ratchet. You put it on and you set your ratchet to off, and you pull it back towards yourself, and it gives you enough room because the belt slips through here. And normally the alternator is mounted on top of the block, so it would be sitting here, and you can, it's just right by your fingers where your ratchet is, and you just kind of pick up on the belt and slide it off, and just kind of remember how the belt was routed. For the most part, on the front of the vehicle by the radiator, there's a belt routing system, or belt routing image. That way you can it shows you how to put the belt back on, or you check your owner's manual, or like I said before, you look it up online. So for the 4th step, for removing the alternator, there's normally 3 to 4 mounting bolts that you want to remove that are going into the front of the block. There can sometimes be a hassle, but you got to remember that in newer vehicles, the bolts are going into aluminum for the top of the valve cover.
Time's up.
So you want to remember that the bolts are going into aluminum on the front of the valve cover, and you do not want to overly tighten them when you're reinstalling the alternator after you remove them. So that's just something to keep in mind. You can always look up what is the torque spec on it. You can always go on to forums online on the internet and figure out what the torque spec could be, or as long as you get it tightened, it doesn't strip the threads out of the inside, you'd probably be fine. And lastly, final step would be installing your new alternator and making sure that everything's tight and you put everything back together correctly. A good way to do that, and the way I remember, is to put everything back together in the same order I took it apart, or reverse order, I guess. And a good way to remember where everything went is just to take pictures and again use the internet and figure out what you couldn't figure out when you were doing it. So that is it. Thank you for listening to my presentation.